Well, it's a profound pleasure and honor for me to be here tonight for this Psychological Humanities and Ethics lecture being put on through the lecture series run through the Center for Psychological Humanities and Ethics at the Lynch School at Boston College. Tonight's talk is being generously funded as part of a grant from the John Templeton Foundation. And I'm just absolutely thrilled to be with William Hendel, who will be presenting his paper on guilt and shame in the city. So tonight, Will's going to talk and take us through his ideas for about 45 minutes or 50 minutes. And then I'm Matthew Clementi, by the way. I'll give a little response to that, some of the ideas that stand out to me that are worth engaging with, and hopefully Will and I will have a little bit of a dialogue. And then we'll open it up to any questions that come in through the question and answer section. You have some instructions in the chat on how to get CEs for this evening's event, so make sure that you follow those if you are registered to get CEs tonight. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce William Hendel. I've known Will now for well over a decade, and he's a thinker whose work I deeply admire. Will, to give a little bit of background, did his JD at Boston College. I think, Will, you ended in 2014, 2015? 2016, and worked as a lawyer for a few years before reading probably too much Camus and Nietzsche and maybe Freud, some of the thinkers he'll be drawing on tonight, and deciding that the world didn't need one more lawyer, and it was time to kind of re-enter the world of philosophical musings. He's right now finishing his PhD in philosophy at Boston College. He's been a co-editor on an academic volume, Misreading Plato, has published in various journals. His work is always not just interesting and thoughtful and thought-provoking, but incredibly well-written. I'm always jealous of his style and his kind of his literary abilities. And I have no doubt that this evening he will bring that forth in what he offers. So, Will, I'm really glad to have you here tonight, and looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much, Matt. Thank you for that very kind introduction. I want to thank you. I want to thank David Goodman. I want to thank the Center for hosting me. It's a tremendous honor. Before I get into my remarks for tonight, I thought maybe it would be worth it if I gave some context as to why I care about guilt and shame. This is a philosophical conversation, but it's coming from a very practical problem. I'm intensely concerned about our political moment right now, both domestically and internationally. It feels like we're on the verge of a time that they write historical annals about, and it's equal parts frightening and curious to me. So the impetus for this talk is I want to think about why we are the way that we are politically. And I thought if we did a philosophical investigation to two of the most powerful motivators of human beings, guilt and shame, maybe we can move towards some sort of insight. I should say, by way of disclaimer, nothing that will follow tonight will be new. Everything that I'm going to say is either derivative or self-evident. You know, if you have read Nietzsche and Freud and Kant and Aristotle and Augustine and Frederick Douglass, you will recognize many of the things, and Schopenhauer, you'll recognize many of the things I'm going to say this evening. My only excuse for this is that I think it's worth bringing them together again and thinking about them now in the moment that we're living through. So what I've done is I have 15, I call them propositions. They're little theses, I guess. And I'm going to walk through each one of them. I have a slide deck that I'm going to pull up in a second, just to help to focus our conversation and to distill some of my ramblings into clear points that hopefully you can engage with, and maybe it will encourage you to think about some things that you can use in your practice. And if not that, just something interesting to focus on and to meditate on. All right, so I'm going to pull up the deck right now. All right, yeah, so the title of the talk is Guilt and Shame in the City. My first proposition is, for civilization to function, citizens need to govern themselves. They need to adopt a moral philosophy and take it seriously. But what is more unserious than moral philosophy? It is embarrassed by its advocates, and it cannot be defended by reason. We need moral philosophy, obviously, to hold us together in communities. We need people to feel moral injunctions, to feel like there's a right and a wrong, to feel like there's certain ways that they need to behave, right? We need to take that seriously. The problem is, if you reflect on it, it's not easy to see why they should individually, why they should take moral philosophy seriously. The first problem is, who's going to lecture us about moral philosophy? Who are going to be our moral teachers, right? In the words of a great moral philosopher, a philosopher's best argument is his life. And to that, I would add, invariably, almost always, it's a counter argument. That's obvious in the case of religious clerics and politicians and activists and actors who want to lecture us. But it's particularly true when you think of political philosophers, the moral philosophers who have given us the ideals that we have organized our communities around, that we've organized our lives around. If we look at their lives, a lot of the time, there's much to be disappointed about, right? I'll run through a couple of examples that stick out in my mind, philosophers that mean something to me. Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant's arguably the most important philosopher of the modern era, and still to this day, probably the most important ethical philosopher, right? Taught us about human dignity, about treating everyone that's rational as ends in themselves, not as merely as means. He's also the same Immanuel Kant that complained to a local prison warden about the singing of inmates. Inmates were singing hymns, and when he opened the windows of his study, he could hear them and he couldn't concentrate, right? Arthur Schopenhauer, famous pessimist and ascetic, went to the opera and played the flute after dinner. He also fathered children with prostitutes. He also threw a woman down a flight of stairs because she was talking too loudly outside of his study. Who else? And maybe I shouldn't just pick on the German philosophers. Rousseau. Rousseau famously abandoned 5 of his children to a Parisian orphanage. John Stuart Mill worked 35 years in the East India Company. John Locke owned stock in the Royal Africa Company and helped author the Constitution of the Carolinas, which had provisions protecting slaveholders. Mahatma Gandhi was alleged to have beat his own wife, right? Moral philosophy seems like it's always embarrassed by some of its most important teachers. So first we have the problem of hypocrisy. But you might say, and certainly Kant would say, moral philosophy is not about who promulgates it. It's about the reasons, about the ideas themselves, right? It's not about what people do. It's not a descriptive science. It's a science of how we ought to live. In the words of Bertrand Russell didn't actually say this, but I like to think that he did. You wouldn't expect a teacher of geometry to be triangular. Why would you expect an ethical professor to be ethical, right? That's silly, but it emphasizes the point. What really matters are the ideas. Is it true? Not who said it, not the character of the person who said it, but is the ideas themselves, do they demonstrate truth, right? All right, well, let's do that. Let's consider ethics purely from the point of reason. Well, in order for something to be something that's knowable, something that deserves a title of knowledge and not merely a belief, there's 2 things that need to be true about it. Either it's self-evident or it's provable, meaning either it requires no proof and can have no proof, or it can be demonstrated somehow. I would submit to you that no moral precept, no moral first principle in the history of ethics is either one of these things, right? Let's take the first one, self-evidence. Things that are self-evident do not need enemies and they do not need friends. Something that is self-evident stands on itself. Moral philosophy as a discipline would not need to exist if what it taught was self-evident, right? That's the first problem. The second problem is if you look at any culture, any civilization, whether a contemporary of our civilization itself, you look back in history, every civilization does something that from the outside is viewed as an enormity, some terrible crime, but from the inside is viewed either as a matter of course or maybe even a matter of pride, right? The trouble with ethics, and the reason why ethics is so hotly contested, is because nothing in it is fundamentally and obviously true. You can always ask, with whatever ethical precept there is, you can ask, why do you believe that? Right? So it's not self-evident. Neither is it provable, right? And this may even be more obvious. Think about, for me, I'm a philosopher. Right now, you can read and should read, if you care about ethics, Aristotle or Plato or any number of texts that were written many thousands of years ago. And you can expect that your perception will be benefited from that investigation. Moral philosophers today read ancient moral philosophers and they admire them and they learn things from them. Contemporary biologists and physicists do not read Aristotle's physics. But contemporary philosophers read his ethics. Why? Because there has been no advance really in moral science since its inception. Because we have the same problem. We haven't advanced past Plato or Aristotle because we have the same question. And the question fundamentally is, who are we? Who are we? We don't know what to do with ourselves or where we should go if we can't say what we are, right? Are we created by accident of nature? Are we created by a benevolent creator? Is our consciousness merely the steam, so to speak, of some vastly complex biological engine? Or is there a rational soul that controls the body like an empire controls a vast swath of land, right? Are human beings equal in any material sense? Are we free? Can we be free in a universe that's determined by natural laws? All of these questions remain open and up to debate, right? So what makes moral lecturing so tedious is that the moral lecturer is always lecturing with his nose up and his fly down, right? He's pretending to know things that we know that he can't pretend, that he can't know. But that leads me to my second proposition. There is nothing that any individual takes more seriously than his own moral propositions. There are no relativists among the wronged, and who has not been wronged? The interesting irony is, for all of these rational problems and the problem of grounding moral philosophy, there is nothing that's more central and more important to us than our moral precepts. And I would submit that there's no such thing actually as a relativist. You can be relativistic about other people, but you can't be relativistic about yourself. Frederick Douglass has a quote that I love where he says, "There is not a man on this earth that doubts whether or not slavery is wrong for him," right? We all know what we deserve. We all know what right and wrong is in relation to us. These are the things that we organize our life around. These are the things that we fight and die and live for. We have to have certainty in moral distinctions. We make them as easily and as confidently as we breathe. Moral distinctions are the foundation of human life, right? So we have this interesting paradox. We have, on the one hand, it seems like it's groundless. On the other hand, it seems like it's the most certain thing. We're more certain of our moral propositions than we are of any scientific truth, right? Anything that you can prove in geometry, you're more certain of what you know to be right and to be wrong. Why? What's the possible justification for that? The will is the ground of moral valuations, not reason. And thus, the two great motivators of the will, inclination, and fear, determine our moral allegiances. So this is not a novel insight, really. All I'm saying here is that facts have no intrinsic valence. They have no intrinsic meaning, right? Facts, is judgments, are fundamentally distinct from ought judgments, value judgments. We unite them all the time. The way that we unite them is with a will. You need a will to unite an is and an ought. Otherwise, there's no necessary correspondence between them. I'll give a silly example, but I think an example that will help you see it. I was reading the New York Times a few weeks ago, and there was a study I saw that any amount of alcohol that you consume will hurt you. There's no such thing really as moderate drinking and being healthy. If you drink alcohol, you will shorten your life and you will increase your chances of getting cancer. That's an is judgment. That's a fact. We'll say it's empirical. I can't vouch for the study, but we'll just say for the purpose of argument, we have factual judgment. Now, can we derive from that judgment that we ought not to drink? No, not necessarily we can, right? It all depends on our relationship to that fact. If you want to live longer, if that's the most important thing to you is to live a long life, then yes, absolutely. If that's what you will, that's what you want, then yes, absolutely, you should not drink based on that fact. If you're more concerned about the tedium of social obligations or the terror of spending a night alone and reflecting with your own thoughts, if you're more scared of that than you are of death, then that's not going to change whether or not you have a drink later this evening, right? What brings an is and an ought together is an underlying will. This is an old philosophical observation, right? Obviously, David Hume is most famous for this, but you can find it as early as Aristotle, right? If you think about Aristotle's moral philosophy, what does he tell us about our character? Our character is determined by our habit, right? We don't reason our way to having a good character. We're habituated to it, because the role of reason in practical philosophy is not to determine ends, it's to determine means. We desire something and then we use our reason to figure out how we're going to get it. But we can't use our reason to figure out what we want. That's the realm of the desire. That's the realm of the will, right? Big theme for Augustine also. If you've ever read Augustine's Confessions, most important autobiography probably in Western literature, it's the story of a man who studied every single philosophy that he could of his day. He was a Manichae, he was a Stoic, he dabbled in astrology, he tried everything, Neoplatonism. Eventually, he ended up deciding that Roman Catholicism was the true religion, the true philosophy. All the arguments for it were the best arguments that he'd ever read, but it changed nothing about his life. Changed nothing about his life. Knowing God was not the same thing for him as loving God. He needed God's grace to intervene because his will was not changed by his knowledge. His knowledge belongs to his will. And until his will is changed, he can't change who he is, right? I think the most obvious example of this in all of literature is the figure of Satan, right? Think of Milton's Satan. Satan is not confused about any of the facts of the matter. He knows who God is. He knows that God is real. He knows that God is all powerful. God has smited him from heaven. But he would rather reign in hell than serve in heaven, right? He'd rather burn than bend his knee. And that's what matters. That's what's fundamental in moral philosophy, practical philosophy. It's the will. The will grounds everything. On to our fourth proposition. The human will inclines towards pride and flees shame. They are the parents of our distinctly human drama, of everything tragic and pitiful, glorious and significant. I would submit to you that human history and all of our literature would be vastly different, may not even exist the way that we understand them, without shame and pride, right? Achilles' rage at Agamemnon is the Iliad. Oedipus's shame is Greek literature, right? The stand of the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae. Judas's suicide. Everything goes back to shame and to guilt. They are primal human motivators, right? They're the only way to get human beings to do things they don't want to do, right? They're what gets soldiers to jump out of a trench to charge a fortified position. It's what gets you to return your shopping cart after you go shopping and walking through the rain back to the little cart stand. That you don't want to do it, but you'll be ashamed if you leave it there for someone to crash into later, right? Shame and guilt is what moves us. Shame, guilt, and pride, in this fifth proposition, shame, guilt, and pride are codependent and inseparable. So let's talk about these for a second in very, very generic terms, not technical terms. Just when we say it, what do we mean by, what does the average person mean when they say shame? When you say shame, you're talking about that agonizing feeling of seeing yourself from the outside, not from the first person, but from the second or the third person, and determining that you're somehow deficient, that you lack something that other people lack. Pride is the exact opposite of that feeling, right? It's the same perspective, still seeing yourself from outside, but determining that you have something that other people want to have, that you're worthy of admiration, right? Like pleasure and pain, they're twins. They're two heads in the same monster, right? You can't have one really without having the other. They replace each other, but they're always together. And if you think about it, the only way for you really to feel shame is because you have some pride to wound in the first place. If you had no pride to wound, there would be no possibility of you feeling any shame. The feeling of shame, when you biologically, when you feel it's that warm, wet, horrible feeling that comes on you suddenly. It's like someone taking a bucket of some warm, disgusting liquid and throwing it over your head. How you were before that happened will completely determine how you are after it happened. If you were in your wedding tuxedo and someone threw that liquid over your head, you'd be very upset. If you were feeling really good about yourself, you'd be very, very hurt. If you're already wet and gross, You're not going to be thrilled about it, but you're not going to feel nearly as bad. So you need to have pride to feel shame. Vice versa. You don't feel proud about things that other people have. Your pride comes from whatever it is. If it's pride in your material possessions, if it's pride even in your virtue, you feel pride because you have something that other people lack. So whether you realize it or not, the basis of your pride is always the lack of someone else. And what shame and pride also share, besides almost everything, is a common accelerant: volition, the idea of agency, the idea that we're responsible for the choices that we make. We feel shame, a particular kind of shame, for things that we had control of that we ought not to have done. And I think we call that guilt. I think that's what guilt really is. When you feel guilty, you feel like you had responsibility and you did something that you need not have done. And the acute pain of it is the vividness of the counterfactual. You can imagine things exactly different if you just had been a different person in that situation, but you weren't, right? That's what makes it so painful. That's what makes it so damaging to our egos. But again, with that pain and with that heightened pain, there is also a kind of reciprocal relief that we get from volition, right? So if part of pride is having something that other people don't have, we don't like to have too much more than other people have, right? It's always slightly embarrassing to be in a situation where we're so much superior to someone else. That makes us uncomfortable. We don't like to see people fail too much, just less than us, right? And the reason why that is that we get an inkling of how lucky we are and how little belongs to us when we see someone who's really much inferior to us in any given thing, right? We get a sense of how much depends on fortune's turning and fortune's wheel. And that makes us very, very uncomfortable. It vaporizes our pride, really. If you think about how much you have that you don't really have a hold on, that was just given to you, very, very hard to feel pride. So you need to have that element of volition. And it soothes us really in two different ways. In the first case, it makes it so we don't have to feel too bad for other people who don't have what we have. Because after all, you didn't make the laws of the universe. You just made the right choices, right? They could have made the right choices, but they didn't. That's on them. On the other hand, you don't have to worry about losing what you've had because you have it because of your agency. You made your own luck, right? So we never give something up, it seems like, psychologically, without getting something back somewhere in return, right? Now, to the sixth proposition. Our susceptibility to guilt, shame, and pride distinguishes us from all other creatures, but it is itself the product of a more elemental distinction. We are the only animal with an imagination. We are the only counterfactual animal, I would say. So one of my favorite Mark Twain quotes, and I actually haven't checked to see if this is apocryphal, maybe it is that man is the only animal that blushes or needs to, right? Shame and guilt and pride belong uniquely to us. If you have a dog, your dog will go outside and tear apart a helpless bunny rabbit and come inside and sleep like a baby and not be bothered with memories of their crime or premonitions of their future karmic retribution, right? The dog is instinctual and present and knows nothing about shame or pride or guilt, right? We're not like that. But the reason why we're not like that, I think, is not because of our intelligence necessarily. It's not because we're the rational animal. We are certainly, in many respects, smarter than other creatures. But I would argue in certain respects, we are also dumber than other creatures. I think human beings die in idiotic ways that other animals don't die in, right? We are distinguished from other animals as regards our intelligence in degree, not in the faculty. There's very intelligent dolphins and primates and elephants, right? We're not distinguished just because we have the faculty of reason. I would submit we're distinguished by a different faculty. So Frederick Douglass says in an excellent underrated speech called Pictures in Progress that he delivered during the Civil War, that what makes human beings is that we're the only picture-making animal, meaning that we're the only animal with imagination. We're the only animal that can see things not merely as they've been, but other than they are, in a way that they've never been before, right? An elephant can remember a trainer who abused them 30 years earlier. But an elephant can't picture the souls huddled on the shore of the Acheron in the Inferno, waiting to be ferried over to hell for judgment, right? That's a human thing. To see things as they are not, to see images in another world that's not here. Nietzsche makes the point, a very interesting point, in the genealogy of morals, probably my favorite point in the whole book. He says that we have a tendency to make a leap that is not actually grounded. We say lightning flashes, right? But that's actually a redundancy. When you separate the subject from the verb there, you're separating something that is the same thing, right? The doer and the deed are precisely the same thing. The lightning and the flash are an identity. Not just for meteorological events. Nietzsche would hold that in every case, the doer is the fiction, the invention added to the deed. It's something that is not rationally grounded. We assume it, we think it all the time, but actually, if you think about it, it's counter-rational for two reasons. The first reason is the only kind of fact there is what actually happened. A counterfactual, by definition, is against the facts. It's positing something that did not happen, that did not occur, right? That's number one. Number two, all of logical operations presuppose cause and effect. You cannot have logic without cause and effect. But if you take cause and effect, and if you take it seriously, it's impossible to want one discrete action to be different, because one action is happening in a chain of causation, right? To want one discrete action to be different, you'd have to want every preceding thing that has ever happened in history to be different. These are not rational positions. We are not the rational animal. We are the counterfactual animal. We are the animal that's defined by our rebellion against what is. We have an idea of something that's better than what is. And that's what makes us human beings. That's what makes us distinct from all the rest of the animal kingdom. The seventh proposition. Our ability to comprehend an alternative world, the world of the possible, compels us to not merely consciousness, but self-consciousness, right? This counterfactual ability makes us aware of ourselves in a way that no other animal seems to be aware of themselves, right? So let's try from the beginning. I have almost a 2-year-old son. He'll be 2 in a month. And I have been watching him very keenly, like Freud watched young Ernst, right? I've wanted to see the glimmer of the self-consciousness. I wanted to see when is his real birth? When is his birth in the world? When is his ego cleaved from the world? And he understands himself as himself, right? That's obviously hard to say from the outside looking in. But for what I seem to have observed is this. He came into the world just as a blind will, right? Just as something that wanted, that needed, that had no concept of objects or world, or even really any distinction between himself and the world. He's just something that wanted and needed something. But then slowly, objects started to take shape for him, right? My wife first, maybe me, the milk bottle, the pacifier, the aspirator, the bath. Everything that was formed in his world was formed in relation to this will. Whether it served the will or was against it, he created a whole world of objects based on what he was fundamentally, which was just this desire and this will and this need, right? So he invented a whole world out of that. And eventually at some point, I'm not sure when, or if it's even totally happened yet, his ego gets cleaved from the world. He realizes that he has immediate control over his body. What he wills in his body happens immediately. He has a kind of immediate control over me and my wife. What he tries to us to get, he gets, and then he has no control over other things. Eventually that will happen. But the bottom line seems to me is that he starts from a will, and the will populates the world and its objects based on what it needs. And if I think about it, I don't know that I am so much different than my son, right? When the things that are conscious to me in a given day are conscious to me insofar as they serve my will or they get in the way of my will, right? And actually, usually the things that serve my will in a predictable way, I don't think about them at all. I think about the things that are impediments to me all the time, right? That's the way my world is created in relation to this will. That in and of itself really doesn't define me or my son as human beings. I think it's probably true for dogs. I think if dogs know who feeds them, they know who kicks them, they know the mailman that they need to bark at, right? They have some consciousness of external objects because they have a will too, they have desires, and they understand things insofar as they serve or impede that will. Self-consciousness needs more than that. It needs more than just a conscious willing and awareness of an external world in relation to that will. I would submit that what conscious needs is imagination. The difference between me and my son, eventually my son, maybe not yet, but eventually between him and a dog, is that we can imagine another world. We have a kind of dual citizenship, right? We're in this world as we perceive it, as we feel it, as we understand it, but we can always imagine other worlds, better worlds, worlds that conform more to what we desire. So we're confronted with that dual citizenship with a question. Why is the world as I imagine it not the world that I perceive it in, right? What is the reason for that fissure between my imagination and my reality? It has to be me. If I were different, the world would be different, right? So now from that migraine, the ego emerges. Because things are not the way that I want them to be, the way that I can see them so vividly, there must be something in me that's not able to effectuate that. And I think you can see this actually with little kids. What do little kids want to know? Why can't I stay up? Why can't I go on that ride? Why can't I have an ice pop for dinner? Right? And what are the answers they get? That you're too little, that it wouldn't be good for you, that I said so. And you gotta make the decisions, I'm your parent. And when you have your own house, you can make your own decisions, right? So what's the universal goal of every child? The first thing they understand themselves as, I am too little, and what I want to be is big. When I'm big and I'm older and I'm a grown up, then I can do what I want to do. But they understand themselves first and foremost because they can imagine another world, a world where they can do what they want to do. They understand themselves as a thing that is not able to do that, something too small, too young, something that is not yet what it wants to be. And then they have a sense of self in a way that other animals don't seem to have a sense of self. The question then is, all right, well, according to whom are they too small? Who says that they're too little? Eighth proposition. We can never be conscious of ourselves without the mediation of some kind of external authority. We always see ourselves through someone else's eyes. So I think to me, this is Matt and I have talked about this for years. This is one of to me, the most troubling philosophical, it's not even really philosophical, it's just a practical observation. People do not see themselves, it seems. In fundamental ways, what people need to do to be happier, to be more effective at whatever they want to achieve is in their blind spot. We can see it from the outside looking in, but we can never see it in regard to ourselves, right? And that's true, I think, in more straightforward examples, right? When you hear your voice on a recording, is there anything more depressing than hearing your voice on a recording, right? That's not what I sound like. I can't believe that's what I sound like. I hate hearing my voice, right? We don't really see what we look like. I was just traveling this week, when you walk down the terminal of an airport, people cannot possibly see themselves as they present themselves to the public in the way that they go out in the public. We do not have the eyes to see ourselves. We don't know what we smell like, right? Every house, every person has their kind of own distinct smell that their nose is blind to. So we are blind to ourselves in some very obvious and troubling ways because we're looking out from ourselves, from the ego, from our own heads, right? We need the mediation of something to tell us, to show us who we are. We need someone else's eyes to do that. And I think it's so important to us that, especially when we're children and we don't know, when we're confronted with this question of why can't we do the things we want to do, the things that we see, we'll accept whatever explanation we get for that. If the explanation is, well, you can't do this now because you're too young, but you're loved and you're valuable, and if you eat your broccoli and you do your homework and you say your prayers, then one day you'll be able to do it. All right, good. That's an explanation I'll take. If the explanation is you were a mistake and you ruined your parents' marriage and you should never really trust anyone who values you, good enough. That's a point now that I can start from. My will now has an idea of myself that I can now make sense of the world and my relationship to it, right? We will, especially when we're young, we'll gobble up whatever the interpretation is that we get. Ninth proposition. Our self-image is unintelligible without a corresponding world. Whoever gives us ourselves must also give us an interpretation of reality. So it's not enough really just to give someone a picture of themselves, because a picture of a self without a world is unintelligible, right? This is if the first critique is good for anything, it's showing us this, right? Objects and subjects are not severable from one another. They're codependent. If a subject is to be intelligible, if an object is to be intelligible, they need a context. They need something in which they can make sense. So this outside person, our parents, our guardian, whoever gives us this vision of ourselves at first, they need to give us an entire worldview. They need to give us an entire picture of reality in order for whoever we are to make sense, right? So if you just take, broad strokes, major philosophies that have had purchase on mankind. So like Neoplatonism and Christianity, right? There is an all-loving creator who has made the universe and who has counted the hairs on your head and who wills things for you and wants you to be something. Therefore, you are a sinner or you are righteous insofar as you're able to give up your will and conform it with his, right? The whole metaphysical picture is required for the subject to understand themselves as something, right? Same thing with the Enlightenment. Maybe there is a God or there isn't a God, we don't know. Maybe, maybe not. But reason is progressing towards a more perfect political union. And you are progressive or enlightened or reactionary or regressive insofar as you contribute to this project or insofar as you block it, right? You need it to understand yourself. You need this philosophy. Take a more basic philosophy. There is no God. There is no reason in the universe. There are no moral truths. All there is the body and its satisfactions. You are strong and noble and good insofar as you have the power to satisfy those satisfactions, and you are weak and common insofar as you don't have the ability to satisfy those desires, right? Regardless, you need something, you need a metaphysic that will give you some anchor for that subject in the world, right? Okay. What does this have to do with politics? So we need to move this now into the political context. What does all of this mean? Talk of the imagination and shame and guilt. What does it mean for us, not just individually, but in communities? Our imagination makes us uniquely difficult to domesticate because we can always have a picture of an alternative. So I would submit to you that our imagination in some ways makes us very, very hard to be domesticated animals. It is not enough for human beings to just use the carrot and the stick. You can train anything from a toy poodle to a killer whale with bribes and blows, right? But that's not enough for human beings. In the first place, because the threat of external force on a person always brings about a kind of obedience that's discontented and unstable, right? If all you can threaten someone with is force, the slightest intimation that you're weak or that you're inattentive or that you're not willing to do what you're going to do will lead to rebellion, right? All the empires that have ever succeeded in world history have understood this. They have made a concerted effort to make their client states understand that there are benefits to subjugation. It's not just because we're more powerful than you, we give you these things, right? You have to do that with human beings. Human beings make terrible slaves because we have an imagination. Even the person in shackles can always imagine themselves free in a way that no other animal can imagine themselves. Because we have an imagination, we will never be contented slaves, right? On the flip side, you can't bribe human beings really either. Every political revolution that's ever happened has had betrayals of the existing order. Someone in the aristocracy, in the ruling class, who was benefiting from the order, who betrayed them, right? Our founding, the American founding, the colonists who founded our country were some of the wealthiest, most influential, powerful colonists here, right? The French Revolution, many members of the French aristocracy were included in the revolution. And even today, the people in our society, many people who are most discontented with it are the most privileged people in society, right? We can always imagine ourselves a little better off. We can always imagine the world a little bit better of a place than it was previously. So the imagination for human beings makes them extremely difficult to subdue, makes us extremely attractive. However, on the other hand, Our imagination also makes us the most trustworthy animal once we're domesticated, because we're never alone. We're always observed by the superego. So what we can do is, which seems like no other animal can do really, is we can take that external authority who gave us ourselves and gave us the world, right? And we can take them into our consciousness and subconsciousness. We can have them watch us at all times. And because we can do that, we can trust human beings to do a lot. We can have self-checkout, and we can have buffets, and we can pass each other on roads going 65, 70 miles an hour, separated only by a yellow painted line, right? Because we have, as human beings, that voyeur who's over our shoulder, who's watching us, who's evaluating us, who's smelling us, who's sensing us, who's seeing us at all times, right? But that's a problem, needless to say, because a superego makes human beings uniquely miserable, right? To be watched in this way is a terrible burden to bear in a lot of respects. Now, in some ways, there's obvious consolations to it. It serves our narcissism, in a sense, to have someone who's watching us and evaluating us and who cares that much about what we do. And I think if social media has proven anything, it's that people would prefer to be talked about and viewed even negatively than not to be talked about and viewed at all. But it seems like that relatively minor benefit is outweighed by all the terrible things that come with it. Being subjected to shame and guilt, to being under that kind of scrutiny at all times, I mean, that's what destroys meaning and happiness and leads to neurotic illness in life, right? Shame and guilt, they work this kind of strange alchemy in us. They turn things that we love and that we're attracted to into disgusting things, and they make disgusting and terrible things into things that we want to do and we want to pursue. We fear them more than we fear death itself, right? There, it's the adder-bitten root of countless suicides and self-maimings down through history, right? It's shame and guilt turn our aggressive instincts from outward and they bring them back in on ourselves. We become the target of those things, potentially to our own destruction, right? It seems like whatever consolations these bring, whether it be to our narcissism, to give us the possibility of feeling pride about ourselves, whatever it might be, they're vastly outweighed by the downsides. It seems like if we were just instinctual, if we didn't have this problem, we would be much happier, right? There's a silly saying, how many legs does a three-legged dog have? Enough, right? A three-legged dog has enough legs. We don't know anything about enough. We don't know anything about contentment because we're always stalked and seen and evaluated in this way. So why? Why have we allowed this to happen to us? Why have we brought this external authority from without and brought them in to the house of our consciousness to guard us, to watch us, to abuse us in some senses, in some cases? The superego is not imposed on us. We welcome him in, however he arrives, however frightening or appalling his aspect, because he answers the riddle posed by the imagination, giving weight to our choices and meaning to our lives and freedom to our will. That sounds counterintuitive, right? That sounds like that can't possibly be right, because without the superego, without the moral watchdog on us, it seems like we would do many more things freely. It's once we have the superego there, then we start to hesitate. Then we start to worry about what we're doing, right? Only when superego is watching us do we stay our hand. I don't know if that's actually true, right? Because if you think about what makes a will free, the will is freest when it's unambivalent, right? The will wants to will an end. It wants to know what it wants, and it wants to see it effectuated. Right? That's what the will wants more than anything. Descartes makes this point in the Meditations, and it's kind of a throwaway point, but I think it's very profound. We're freest when we know precisely what it is that we ought to do. That's when our will can go and do what it wants to do. The superego gives us that, right? The first thing it gives us is convictions. It gives us convictions. It gives us a picture of the world as it is, right and wrong, true and false, good and evil, right? To have that and to have the benefit of that foundation, of that conviction, it frees our hand, it lets it go. And the great trick to the conviction is that we don't realize that it's coming from some external authority, right? The superego is within us. It's in our house. So arguments from authority are famously, as Aquinas says, the weakest kinds of arguments there are, right? It's the my dad says of arguments. It's a terrible argument. If you were conscious of the fact that your convictions were basically just that, just my dad says, you would be very unsure of them, right? And actually, I think at a certain point in everyone's life, they're unsure of the things that their father had told them that they previously held. They found out their father was just a guy like anyone else, right? But the superego is something that you take within you into your consciousness. So what he tells you is not just an interpretation of the world like anything else. It's the world. It's the world as it is in reality. So now we're free to pursue things, to choose things to do, right? That's the first thing. The second thing that gives the will trouble is not being able to see it realized, right? The will wants to will, but it doesn't just want to will. It wants to have its will felt in the world. It wants to see its will be done. It wants to see its will come to fruition. What the superego does is it allows you to be the place where that happens, right? The reason why we don't do a lot of things that we want to do is not because of some great virtue, usually, right? There's a great La Rochefoucauld maxim that people are valorous and chaste, not always because of valor and chastity, right? A lot of the times, the reason why we don't do things that we want to do is just because we can't do them and we're afraid of the consequences. What the superego does is he gives us a place where we can vent what we want to do ourselves, allows us to turn our instincts around and put them on ourselves and to feel like we're not doing it because we're weak. We're doing it because we're right. We're doing it because it's just. We should punish ourselves because we deserve to be punished, right? So what the superego does is it unleashes the will. It gives the will a ground and a reason and a way to live, right? 14th proposition. The superego can be modified or replaced, but never disposed of. So we accept the superego at some point in our lives. We have some initial authority figure, our parents, our guardian, whoever gave us our first conception of ourselves and conception of the world. I think for most people, many people, that changes over the course of a life. Very rare, I would think, that you keep the same one that you had in all respects from the beginning of time to the end. And the reason is that you see eventually that initial authority is just a person like anyone else, like I was just saying. You eventually find out your father, your mother, your guardian, they're just fallible people. And so you go to your peers, or you go to your professors, or you go to philosophy, or you go to politics, and you find that other authority. But the important point is you have to find that other authority. It can't be you, ultimately. And the reason why it can't be you is because, as we said from the very beginning, reason doesn't give us the foundation that we need. Metaphysics has failed us, right? The Enlightenment dream of escaping dogmatism, of escaping religion has failed. We need to go to another authority. So the question isn't whether we'll have that other authority or whether we'll adopt it. It's just which authority are we going to choose to tell us and give us the picture of the world we need in order to live and to act and to make our suffering make any sense. And the reason why that is because the alternative to that, to live in a radical acceptance of the metaphysical uncertainty of our lives and our world, of our moral propositions, I think is beyond most people, right? I think it's a burden that it would take a superhuman to bear that burden. So we have to take on some authority somewhere who's going to make sense of the world for us. Leads to the last 15th proposition. All moral arguments are ad hominem arguments. Now, by that I mean all moral arguments are personal arguments. Because we can't appeal to facts and reason to to settle these debates, we have to go to the authorities that everyone's relying on, right? And I think for me, I think this is a very old insight. I mean, this is what Socrates does, right? When you read the dialogues of Socrates against the sophists, he does not famously gives very, very bad arguments metaphysically and rationally. But what he does is he shows that the sophists are not equal to his challenge. They're not equal to play his game. They're not equal to the logical traps that he set for them, right? That's what you have to do to change someone's mind in moral philosophy, unfortunately, I think. And I think it's reflected just in the regular folk wisdom. You know, it's impolite to discuss religion and politics at the table, right? Why? Well, because it will get heated and it will get personal. Why? Why does it necessarily have to get heated and personal? Well, because it is personal, right? We chose these things. We've chosen these authorities on a basis that we cannot defend rationally entirely. That's the problem. So we have to rely on someone else. And to change someone's mind, to change a moral system, means to attack the credibility of that authority. That if we hold that moral system, someone that we take very seriously. So moral arguments are always going to be, unfortunately, of an intensely personal nature. And the way that you win them is by embarrassing that authority, by catching them in a contradiction, by catching them in hypocrisy. If you watch cable news now, what is it about? Whatever the political orientation on the channel, they spend 99% of their time focused on the other side, pointing out all of the hypocritical and terrible things that they do. Why? Because that confirms to them the choice of their authority, right? See these other authorities? These other authorities can't be trusted. These other authorities are a joke. These other authorities are not real moral authorities. That's ultimately what moral philosophy has to come down to, because of its tenuous metaphysical footing, right? So that leads me to my actual last point. So I said 15 propositions, but it's 16 actually. And this is not my point. This is from T.S. Eliot from Four Quartets. I think the upshot of all of this is that humility is really important when it comes to ethical, political debates. We, all of us, no matter how much you disagree with whatever anyone's political orientation, we are all accepting it and coming to our political orientation for the same reason, ultimately, I think, is because we need something that gives us a way of interpreting our world and making sense of our suffering. And people have come to it not because they are dumber than us or because they're not operating in good faith, for all sorts of reasons. But the main reason is that we need it. We all need it. So we should just have a little bit more respect and openness to one another, I think, when we realize that our positions are not necessarily the adamantine laws of the universe, right? So thank you very much for your attention. It's very hard listening to these lectures over Zoom, so and especially with PowerPoint. But Matt, do you want to?
Yeah, thank you, Will. You raised too many provocative points for me to locate just one. It's obvious to me some of the thinkers that you were leaning on most. Of course, you have Freud and Nietzsche are huge influences here. And Will, would you mind just clicking out of your PowerPoint so we can see each other a little better? And obviously Plato is another huge influence here. I was thinking about Plato as you were talking, and when you came to the end of this, you kind of anticipated part of my question. My first question, and also please add questions to the Q&A if you have them, and we'll get to those in a couple minutes. But, those thinkers take obviously a fundamentally tragic view of human beings and the human situation. We live with this ambiguity, and yet the ambiguity is unlivable for us. We can't act like. The reality of our lives is that things are very ambiguous, and yet ambiguity is overwhelming. It stifles action. It makes decision-making tenuous, if not impossible, right? And it also in many ways would make political action and life together in community impossible.
Yeah.
Because if we don't have a vision of what the good is and what we need to do, it becomes very difficult in times of crisis to make a choice and to follow a direction and to follow a path, right? So like these things have big implications, not just for us individually in our day-to-day lives. I know for me, if I feel the ambiguity of things, I feel very stifled, obviously. But as a society, as living
Right.
together with other human beings, this has
Right.
huge implications. And I take it that all three of those thinkers, maybe least of all Nietzsche, but definitely Freud and Plato, see this thing as this predicament that we're in, where we need some sort of moral authority that we can lean upon and rest our values upon, even if it's illusory, right? As kind of a mixed bag, right? Both a curse and a blessing,
Yeah.
right? That social life is impossible without it, and civilization is a boon and a benefit to us, and it's a good thing in so many ways.
Right.
Now, it seems to me that Freud in Civilization and Its Discontents is very much, as I say, on the side of civilization,
Yeah.
and hopeful even, or at least open to the thought that we might be able to orient this aspect of human life in a more positive direction.
Yeah.
You know, you brought in humility at the end as
Yeah.
something that's kind of essential for this.
Yeah.
But I wonder, I mean, obviously you're adopting a lot of the kind of tragic and pessimistic view in your assessment,
Yeah.
but I wonder what you see as possibilities for taking this insight
Yeah.
about us and using it, the insights that you're drawing out, as maybe correctives for aspects of
Yeah.
our current political problem, because it seems to me like a big part of our problem that you're identifying pretty aptly is that we identify ourselves and our meaning and our lives with our moral suppositions.
Yes.
And then when someone disagrees, right, it's no longer that you just disagree with my thoughts on an issue. You are attacking me. You know, my identity is being attacked, my source of meaning, my internal superego, my internal authority. So that's threatening to me. And a lot of the animosity that we see probably always in politics, you know, today's not so unique, but is because the attack of my political ideas or leanings or my moral ideas or leanings aren't just an attack on ideas, right, on a philosophy or a worldview. They're an attack on my very self. And so how do we negotiate that problem along with this insight to make kind of a healthier dynamic in our politics and how we relate to one another?
Those excellent questions. I think the first part of your question, I think that for less so for Plato, but for Nietzsche and Freud, I really believe that what they thought they could do was, if they pointed out that the sources of shame and guilt were not the iron laws of the universe, right? That they came from somewhere, that they weren't necessarily the iron laws of the universe, right? That they came from somewhere, that it could relieve certain people from suffering a kind of self-inflicted masochism that didn't need to be, right? I think that's a lot of what Freud was trying to do with psychoanalysis. He was trying to help people that didn't need to suffer from their own hand, right? So what this insight could do potentially is to help people not so hard on other people, but also not so hard on themselves, right? It can help people to understand that, you know, you're hurting yourself on the basis of something that you cannot be sure of in the way that you think that you're sure of it, right? But that leads to the second part of your question, the much bigger problem, which is, well, if you're going to be humble about this, you're going to lose the benefit of all of it, right? It seems how can you be humble about it and honest about the dubious nature maybe of the ideals that you hold, or the grounding or the footing of it, and then still fight for them and still have them mean something for you and still have meaning in your life? And so that's a question that I'm still wrestling with, because I think the way forward from here is not that, like I said at the beginning, I'm not a relativist. I don't believe that anyone's a relativist. But I think we do need to find another grounding other than reason and other than just our own commitments. We need something that's universal. I think possibly the aesthetic has something there for us, maybe, of something that's universally open to appreciation. But you run back into the same sorts of problems. So I guess my answer is I don't know. I don't know how we can navigate humility and honesty about these things while still maintaining our commitment to them. And I don't know how you question someone's deeply held convictions without questioning them and who they are as a person. I think it might be something as simple as the way that you do it and the tone that you present it in, and the honesty that you have about your own positions. But I think it's unavoidable. I think it's an inevitable problem.
This gets me in some ways too, because you were talking about there needing to be some sort of universal grounding for things. I was thinking toward the tail end of your talk about the Grand Inquisitor section of the Brothers Karamazov, right?
Yeah.
And Dostoevsky is putting forth a very similar idea in some ways of human beings and what motivates us and what we're looking for. And part of what we're looking for, the Grand Inquisitor says, is the security of an authority figure who can tell us right from wrong and give us that kind of orientation, just like you say, only though we take that into ourselves, right, is a big part of what you're doing there, tying that with Freud. It seemed to me, the idea of the Grand Inquisitor works in a more uniform society. And I think another problem that your talk is kind of teasing out, we live in a very large country.
Mm-hmm.
And democracy is messy in small communities, right?
Yep.
But it seems also like we're disconnected from one another in our grounding principles, and those grounding principles rely upon and lean upon various authorities, right? Yep. And so it seems to me too, like part of why this problem is maybe more pronounced today, or we feel it more acutely today, is because of the type of social and political environment we live in, which is a big, diverse, dispersed, broad society in which we don't have a lot of touchstone authorities, right? Yeah. Like who my authority might be will be very different from yours. And we don't even track ourselves back to the same cultural figures anymore. Like I'm thinking about how, thinking of my grandfather and my great uncle and stuff, how for them, the ideals, the internal authority, a lot of it, at least politically, came from things like the American founding, or right. Even if it was just FDR, right? Like for that generation, right? They had, these kind of figures. Whereas today, we seem much more dispersed. I mean, of course, we know the faults of the founders. We know the faults of the people who we would have looked to as those kind of exemplars previously. And more those figures are being undermined. So to what degree does this problem, is this exacerbated in a big, diverse democracy? And how does that play out in kind of the contemporary climate?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this in relation to liberalism as a political system, right? So if Nietzsche and Freud broadly are right about the way that we come to our moral allegiances, does that militate in favor or against liberalism, right? So on the one hand, it seems like it does, because we should be open to different viewpoints and we should be tolerant of other people's religions, right? Because for this reason, because we can't have a metaphysical foundation that's ironclad, that everyone is entitled to pursue this question, because the question is still an open question. On the one hand, right? Maybe that's in favor of liberalism. On the other hand, to have a society, you have to have laws. The society has to make decisions. It has to punish offenders. It has to define what an offense is. And the people under those laws have to share that interpretation of reality, so something has to win out in the end when it comes to government. There has to be a decision. There has to be a kind of universal civic faith in that community on something, right? So there seems to be a very clear limit to toleration on a certain end and still having a political community function. So even when you think about liberal toleration, from, you know, the ideas of toleration coming from the 17th and 18th centuries, they were thinking of broadly of different kinds of Christianity, right? Or even just broadly Judeo-Christian ideals, but those coexist relatively easily with one another as compared to all the different kinds of ideas and faiths that we have now. So I don't know actually if you can really have a political, after a certain point of disagreement, and no matter how much goodwill and humility you could have a political community of people of completely divergent moral bases, right? I think at a certain point you would have to have different communities if you can't come to something that you could, some common ground, something that you can all stand on and agree with. You know, I do think, however, having said that, I think a lot of the talk in this country about national divorces and stuff are crazy. I think we still have way more in common with each other than we realize. And a lot of this is inflamed by social media and other things. I think we still have a lot of things that we can stand on together. But I do think after a certain point, I think divorce is inevitable. Yeah.
So we have a question from Dr. Bob, my good friend who I know well. Good to have you here, Bob. Asking about the difference between kind of a healthy guilt and a toxic shame. I was thinking about this in relation to pride too. So maybe you could just touch upon this. I mean, these things are, it seems to me in your assessment, kind of two-sided, both necessary and problematic. But is there a different, are there differences in degrees, right? Like, can you have a sort of guilt that remains in check and is not just the self-lacerating of the superego? What about pride? Is there a kind of pride that's not delusional about its own capacities? So maybe we could talk.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. I think definitely, absolutely, it's not all the same, certainly. But the problem is, it's a value question still about when pride and guilt get out of hand. What kind of pride and guilt are good or bad, right? So if you think about ancient Greek civilization, if you think about the Iliad, and if you think about the Odyssey, the pride of the heroes in that, the pride of Odysseus, the pride of Achilles, the pride of Diomedes particularly, right, would seem maybe from our perspective to be overdoing it, out of sorts, right? But for their culture, that was the cultural ideal. So I think you still run into the problem of, I think in every value system has an idea about how much pride you should have, how much pride is healthy or salubrious for you, how much guilt and shame is healthy or salubrious. I think obviously you need both to have a functioning society. But the question of drawing the line is, again, it's one of those value questions. So you have to adopt a certain philosophy, a certain metaphysic to be able to determine, okay, at this point, this is no longer healthy, right? The Opus Dei members who self-flagellate, right? From a certain perspective, that's too much guilt. That's unnecessary guilt. That's guilt where they're harming themselves. For the metaphysic that they're operating under, that's perfectly right. That's what's going to mortify their soul and to get their soul aligned with God's will. So I would agree that definitely in every system, there are degrees and there's healthy and unhealthy. But the question is, well, how do we pick the system that makes a determination? You know?
And then we have a question from Deborah Myers. Is it possible that sociopaths and some narcissists have rid themselves of the superego? And I would caveat onto that, or bookend onto that. I was thinking this at the end of what you were saying. You were saying that it seems like only a superhuman, could live with ambiguity, right? And that superhuman could be demonic, as Deborah's question rightly points out, right? Like sociopathic. But is it possible? Is there another possibility for living with the ambiguity of this rather than like having to resort to some sort of internal authority? Or would you exclude that possibility in a positive sense, right? Can that be done positively, only negatively? What are your thoughts on that?
A really good question. So I have no clinical experience. I have no psychology background to pull on for evidence of this, but when I think about the superego, I think about it differently than Freud in many ways that Freud thinks about it. I think Freud's thinking it predominantly of the rigid Christian society having moral rules. When I think about the superego, I think about it much broader than that. I think about it as someone who gives you the philosophy of the world and of yourself in order to make it intelligible. So I would think that even a serial killer, even someone with a horrible personality disorder, would still need some sort of authority that helps them to understand the world and to understand themselves. That authority doesn't have to be a moral authority in the way that we think about it. But when I talk about moral authorities, I just talk about a valuing authority. So it's entirely neutral what kind of values those are. It could be a moral authority that tells you that the only thing you need to pursue in this world is domination, and that you're only worthy insofar as you're able to dominate and hurt people. And the people who let you dominate and hurt them deserve everything that they get. So I think it's possible, certainly, that a sociopathic person could, I think they need to. I think everyone, even the sociopaths, needs some sort of interpreter of reality for them that they can lean on to understand themselves in the world.
I would encourage people to write in more questions if you have them, but while we're waiting, I'll kind of keep engaging with you here. I thought one of your more interesting and provocative points was about human beings being the counterfactual animal, like us being able to imagine the world other than it is. Yeah. You know, you brought in your son Wes as an example. I'll never forget my oldest son when he was little. He was maybe 2 years old, 2.5, and I was doing colors with him. You know, what color is this? And he'd say red. What color is this? And he'd say black. And my landlord was doing some construction in the backyard, had this big backhoe in the backyard. And I said, what color is Chris's backhoe? Now, it was blue, but he looks at me and he says, orange. And I knew he knew his colors. So I said, you know, Dominic, what color is this? And he said, orange. And at that moment, I realized that there was something pretty remarkable going on because he knew how to lie. Yeah. And so to be the counterfactual animal means also to be capable of saying things that are not true. Yeah. Or seeing things that are not true, or imagining things that are other than as they are.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Yeah, we're also the only animal that lies. Yeah. Yeah, I was thinking of your boys actually, when I made the point about the kids understanding themselves as being too small and too little. Because I remember you telling me, them saying to you, once they have their own house, they're going to have you over and they're going to make you do whatever it is that they want to do, right? I think it's evident from a very early age in children that they have this capacity, but I think it coincides with that first moment of self-knowledge. I think before that, so my son right now, he knows me, he's speaking a little bit, and he knows me, he knows my wife, and he knows his grandparents, and he knows cars, and we go on a walk, he's like, car and tree and sky. But I don't think that he knows himself yet, because he hasn't needed to know himself yet. He hasn't had the vision of the alternative reality that he wants but can't have. He wants things, and he knows who will get him what he wants, but he's not yet, as far as I can see, afflicted, because it's a consolation and an affliction, right? Frederick Douglass makes this point in the Pictures in Progress essay, and I think I've taken, you're right, the pessimistic angle on this, but it's an intensely optimistic angle on it too. The reason why we're able to achieve what we achieve as human beings is precisely the same faculty. You know, the Gothic cathedral exists because a human being imagined it, pictured it, and did it. Progress in racial rights and equality happened because Martin Luther King, I had a dream speech, right? He dreamed of a society that was different than the society that he lived in. That allowed progress to occur, right? So it's not a wholly negative faculty. It's just the human faculty, right? At bottom, it's just, this is what makes us us and not something else.
Well, on that point, You were saying that part of what happens when we develop this ability to see that the world, see the world as we'd like to imagine it, or we would want it to be in accordance with our will. And then the world as it is, kind of the Freudian reality principle that we bump up against. And we see that disparity between the two.
Yep.
And you said we tend, at that point, we posit a self because we say there's something wrong with me, that the world that as I want it to be is not the world as it is. Right. And that is kind of the pessimistic view, in a sense, like the self, you turn on yourself at that point and say, what's wrong with me, that either I can't bring this about, I can't realize this, or that I want something that's completely fictitious. I think that all the time about myself. Why do I want things that are so unrealistic and that could never be the case, right? But the other direction that you could go with that, I suppose, is here's the world as it presents itself to me. Here's the world as I want it to be. What's wrong with the world that it's not what I want it to be? Let me make it what I want it to be. I'll do the thing. I'll build the cathedral, or I'll revolutionize how human beings think about X or do X, or I'll be the one who is the catalyst for that. I mean, there's still a realization of the ego at that point, right? It's an ego that says, I will be the one to do this. I'll cause this change because I'm going to make the world actually a mirror of myself now. I'm going to make the world mirror my desires.
Well, I think that's kind of Nietzsche's position, right? The position that I'm talking about it from the ascetic ideal position, really, and the ideal that leads to all the nihilism that Nietzsche hates. But you're talking about it from Nietzsche's idea of being a Superman, which is, I'm going to be the artist. I'm going to remake reality in my image. There's not something wrong with me. There's not something wrong with the world, right? I will do it. I will make it the way that I want to make it. And in doing that, I'll be healthy. I will not be afflicted by shame and guilt. Nietzsche says it's, I think it's the end of book 3 of The Gay Science, that to him, the human thing to him is to free someone from shame. Right? That's what it means to be human. That's what it means to do the right thing, is to free someone from shame. The bad thing is to make someone feel shame. The disgusting thing about human beings is always making other people want to feel shame. Right? So it's not all negative necessarily. There are other ways to take it. My problem with Nietzsche's position, though, is I don't think there's any evidence anyone's ever done that. I don't think there's any evidence anyone's ever freed themselves from the dogmatism and then was able to live this flourishing life. If anything, I see from the outside looking in, it's very obvious to overrate the happiness of people. The people that seem happiest to me are the people that are most assured of their principles and least curious about them. Those seem to be the most content people to me. So
that's back to Dostoevsky's Notes from the Underground, right?
Yes.
Where self-consciousness is this affliction that prevents you from acting, and it stifles your ability to do things. And the unconscious person can go forth and say, this is justice, and I'll do the just thing because I know it, and I can charge straight ahead and do what I want.
The ingenuous man, right? Zerkov can go out with his friends and philander, and he can be confident in what he does because he's not afflicted with consciousness in that way. But I think that also goes to Nietzsche's point that consciousness and philosophizing come out of a kind of sickness, kind of weakness in the first place. If you are doing what you want to do, if your will is being actualized, right? And think about the example of the great athletes. When a great athlete is doing what they do, they're not thinking. They're just doing what they will happens and it follows. That in a lot of ways is our ideal. It's you become conscious because you can't actualize what you want. They're seeing it and doing it. It's when you can't do that, then all of a sudden you become reflective.
Yeah, and that's where the guilt and things like that.
Exactly.
We have another question, again from Dr. Bob. Comment on Levinas' philosophy as ethics, and in particular, his precognitive responsibility for the other.
I don't know. I am not well versed in Levinas. What I do know of Levinas, I would say that he's part of the 20th century attempt to get philosophy out of the problems of metaphysics, right? To say that you don't need a metaphysical grounding for a philosophy. It's just the fact that when you're confronted with the other, you have philosophical responsibilities, you have ethical responsibilities. The face of the other gives you the injunction. But I'm not so convinced that that's true, actually. I think there is a truth in it, but I think even that fact, that the idea that the face of the other could give you an ethical injunction, requires some sort of metaphysics underlying it, right? I don't think you can get away from the problem of metaphysics. I think when you have an ought judgment, you always have an is of some kind, whether it's conscious or unconscious. And that is that you're founding that ought on is always taken somewhere from an authority, because you can't establish it on its own. So obviously I agree that we have massive ethical responsibilities to other people, but I think that's part of my own faith, my own value system, that I've inherited from somewhere. I don't know that it's universal.
So for you, in relation to this point, because of course the kind of phenomenological ethics, yeah, as you rightly say, is attempting to kind of divorce itself from the metaphysical grounding and the whole history of problems that come along with that. I think Levinas, and I too am not the best reader of Levinas, but of course I'm familiar with his work. But isn't it that for him, the is of the face, right, the face that presents itself to you, is a face that needs, that wants, and so the ought and the is are almost unified, almost bound together in a way that one's not derived from the other, right? It's like it's the neediness of the other that presents itself to me, immediately gives me my responsibility in a way that I don't even have to think about it, or I don't rationalize it in any sense.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I think that that's very interesting possibility. But I guess my hesitation is the empirical horrible fact that there are people who do not feel that pull, that do not feel that reality, right? I know that, you could pull anything from the Holocaust, but the Einsatzgruppen, who followed the German army east and commit all kinds of atrocities behind the military lines in just cities and wiped out whole communities. It was discovered that many years after the war, one of the Einsatzgruppen soldiers, who was not prosecuted, like many of them were not, had a photo album in his house from that campaign, and it was titled "The Good Old Days." Right. So this is someone who murdered men, women, and children, who was not afflicted by their faces. He was not troubled at all by what he did. And in some perverse way, he was proud of it. So I don't know.
And that seems to suggest an internal moral authority, as you were saying, in the sense of I've taken into myself a worldview and an idea that tells me that this is the good, even though it's not, it's very obviously antithetical to what we would say is moral, right?
Okay.
It's still a moral ordering that has been brought into that person's inner workings, and an authority that he can rest assured on, that he's done the good thing, and that those are the good old days because that's when he was capable of doing the good thing.
And doing what was right. I think there was a real sense for some of these guys that it wasn't just something that they got away with. It was something that perversely that they thought was the right thing for them to do. It's what their duty told them to do in the circumstances, which is, very difficult to wrap your mind around.
Well, it also your assessment in some ways helps to explain, I think, why it is that otherwise very civilized and cultured people could commit atrocities, because the authority with which, to which they ascribe, the grounding that they've brought within to themselves, deems that just, or deems that good.
Yeah, the Einsatzgruppen, they didn't empty the prisons to get these guys. These are guys with PhDs. They were doctors and lawyers. These were intelligent, highly educated individuals doing these things, but they had subscribed to this worldview that had swallowed them.
Maybe we could end by ending, because we're right at the end here. And thank you again, everyone who's been with us. Just to touch back on your final point, you have kind of this, dour assessment of the human situation, but then you end on something that seems to me like what can we do?
Yeah.
And it's a call for more moral and ethical humility and honesty about the fact that although we might feel convicted deeply, that we need to have the humility to try and engage with, in kind of an honest understanding, other people. My question would be, like, where's the line with that, right? Because there is, to some degree, I think, a fair challenge that could come up that would say, well, certainly we should try to understand other people to a point and to understand their moral authorities to a point, but there has to be a line somewhere, because it's a pretty slippery slope to getting into this ambiguous area, this morally ambiguous area, and then putting up with and allowing for, really kind of dangerous or atrocious ideas to be perpetuated because, well, my moral authorities know God, so, who am I to judge or something like that? So what would you say?
I would say it's an extremely difficult question. I think there's no way to draw the line except to admit that you're right. We have to choose. We ultimately have to choose, and hopefully just the realization of the metaphysical underlying difficulties will help us be a little bit more merciful, a little bit more open-minded, not just with other people, by the way, with ourselves too, with our judgments about our guilt and our unworthiness, be a little bit easier on ourselves. But you're right. Ultimately, we have to make decisions, and there's no possible way to sketch out a line of where is too far or where is enough. It's just my hope is just that some openness to these questions will help us be a little bit more open with each other. But you're right. Eventually, we have to decide, and we have to defend ourselves and our families, and we have to choose.
Well, Will, thank you so much. It was very, very interesting and engaging conversation this evening. So really appreciate the time and effort that you put into it. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I'm Matt Clementi. This has been a lecture in the Psychological Humanities and Ethics lecture series here, put on through the Center for Psychological Humanities and Ethics at Boston College in the Lynch School. And I could not be more grateful for your attendance and your participation, and look forward to seeing you at the next one. Thank you all very much.